I imagine your plane crashing, all the exit lights flashing. Your oxygen mask does not inflate. I look at today's date and worry. Will I observe the anniversary of your death on this date every year? The day you take your last breath.
The fact that 21st century composers are still interested in using the operatic voice, it just baffles me, because we have the technology now for singers to deliver texts clearly, to sing with straight tone without straining. But what got me into songwriting was my own singing voice and, you know, wanting to be a part of wanting my physical voice to also be a part of my artistic voice. And I think that's partly to do with my extreme dislike of the classically trained voice and the fact that there are very, very few people who have been trained to sing with straight tone, with microphones. And in fact, even those who can do it, vocalists who can do it, will often complain that it will eventually damage their voice, as though our voices don't get damaged when we get older anyway. Like, I mean, I think I went into to singing my own songs and to songwriting because I felt like my voice, my physical voice, was the means through which to express my work at the time. And nobody else's voice would do.
What a sight I am to behold. I couldn't look any queerer. The end is ever near. I'm getting older every time I look in the mirror. My mommy said,
I'm interested in moving people, I'm interested in telling stories, I'm interested in doing all of those traditional things that songwriters do in the pop world and in the folk world. But I think I want my music to exist in the classical contemporary music world, in part because that's the world in which people come to concerts to listen. I can't stand it when people aren't there to listen. It hurts my feelings, it makes me feel incredibly vulnerable, it makes me feel like the work I'm doing is not worthy. Other People's Love Songs for me was an experiment in, I mean, it was much more than that, but it in part is an experiment in creating some, you know, in challenging the assumption that a songwriter who's writing love songs, you know, needs to be autobiographical or confessional. And I think I do that with a lot of my other pieces too, like with the subsequent pieces, Removable Parts and 13 Near-Death Experiences, and even Last Words from Texas. I'm looking for people with whom I do not relate, and then trying to find a way to relate to them that I hope eventually reaches the audience. In other words, I hope the audience goes through the same transition that I go through. Whereas at first I feel like, well, I can't relate to this subject, so I'm going to write a song cycle about it until I can relate to it. And I hope that audiences and listeners go through that same process, because I think it's important for us to empathize with people even if we are at first alienated by their behavior or we find them strange or whatever. I think empathy is a really important skill to have in order to really function in the world in a fully creative way.
I've sworn off running my worn-off fingertips over anyone else's skin. And when I see you again, I'll demonstrate some soulmate you are.
I think I'm just turned off by music that presents us with so many ideas at a time or throughout the duration of a piece that you feel a bit overwhelmed, and or I feel a bit overwhelmed, and I feel that the composer is trying to prove something about how many ideas he or she has. And I've always just been interested in process and economy of means, and that kind of music actually moves me and resonates with me more because it's this singular idea that then gets gradually developed. But you know, I don't ever think about my work in historical terms. I don't think about how the work that I'm doing now relates to the trajectory of classical music or the history of music. That is something that I decidedly avoid thinking about. In part because of the anxiety of influence, and in part because of my belief that if I'm going to create something that's my own, then I shouldn't be going back and looking at examples of what people have done before with the same instrumentation or with, you know, the same art song form. Or so, you know, although I studied music history, I don't, and I've listened to a lot of older works, I never, when I'm writing a piece, go back and research what's been written for this ensemble before and try to, you know, think about how I'm going to respond to that or how I'm going to relate to that. It's not something I do. And that, to me, is something for critics and listeners to, those comparisons are something that I think critics and listeners should be making, and not me. And I always tell people when the subject of postmodernism comes up in relation to my work that I don't feel like I consider myself a postmodernist in the sense that I accept postmodernism as a challenge. I want to use artifice and humor and irony and flatness and deadpan and tricksterism as a way of, I hope, getting at something deeply human.
I don't hate you for feeling shitty. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's pity. Everything is dull when you stay in bed. Hold your tongue, control your emotions. Get those dismal thoughts out of your head.